to the mix seems to have been a bridge too far for the Canadians, and to this day there is a marked resistance in this country to embracing the whole Pilgrims and Indians theme of the holiday. That resistance has nothing to do with the obviously BS nature of the legend, but rather a deeper Canadian bias towards rejecting American history as something irrelevant and foreign. I mean, I think you could very easily make the case that the arrival of the English Pilgrims to Massachusetts is more a part of a shared North American history than just US history per se. To the extent the Mayflower represents any sort of important turning point in the British settlement of this continent, it's obviously relevant to Canada too. But emphasizing Canada's distinct history has always been an important part of Canadian nationalism, thus making it inevitable that any holiday traditions too overtly about American history would be shunned here. Anyway, the end result is that Canadian Thanksgiving has today become a fairly bland sort of holiday with no real narrative or lore justifying it, which means few decorations and no cartoons or school plays or parades or any of the other stuff that has helped build up its reputation in the US. In fact, I would go so far as to say most Canadians really have no idea of what their version of Thanksgiving is even supposed to be celebrating, which can give it a bit of a going through the motions vibe and a mythologizing of American Thanksgiving as something really epic by comparison. My father used to always say, you know, in America, Thanksgiving is bigger than Christmas. And everyone would nod because that's the kind of thing Canadians believe. But Canadian Thanksgiving does have one thing going for it. It's celebrated on a different day than American Thanksgiving. And simply doing an American thing in a way that is slightly different than what is done in America is usually enough to give something a sense of meaning in Canada. All right, next holiday we're going to talk about is Remembrance Day, November 11th. So the First World War was the biggest war that Canadians had ever participated in, as Britain mobilized its overseas colonies to fight its European enemies. Over 60,000 Canadians were killed, and the amount of death and destruction that the war caused famously helped make much of the world regard war as something inherently horrible and traumatizing, as opposed to normal or glamorous. In 1919, the year after the war ended, the British government decreed that there should be a national day of remembrance across the empire for fallen soldiers. On the 11th of November, the day that peace was officially declared, Britain played an active role promoting an empire-wide standard for how the war's memory should be commemorated, with traditions and symbols that encouraged the public to regard the men who had fought for king and country as brave but tragic heroes, and to focus on the selflessness of their sacrifice more than what the war was actually about. 100 years later, it is quite striking to observe just how many of Canada's Remembrance Day traditions continue to be bound up in these World War I era imperial customs. Poppies, white crosses, the poem Flanders Fields, the laying of wreaths at enormous Lest We Forget monuments. These were all part of a certain suite of early 20th century traditions designed to make Canadians think about war in a very particular way. And from this, a couple of contemporary controversies have arisen. One is the argument that much of Canada's Remembrance Day regime simply glorifies war by emphasizing a certain kind of old-fashioned sentimentality about it, rather than, say, encouraging a reflection on the politics that lead to it. In some corners of the political left, activists have accordingly been trying to get Canadians to stop wearing poppies around Remembrance Day, or to make white poppies a thing, and thereby reject the supposed war apologia that the red poppy tradition supposedly represents.
Expand their focus on Remembrance Day to include also the civilians who are estimated to make up over 90% of the victims of contemporary war, and to question whether war is really an effective means of resolving conflicts.
This movement, in turn, has been greatly exaggerated by a lot of Canadians on the right, who have made fighting this supposed war on poppies into this big culture war thing in order to demonstrate how much they support the troops.
It's a sense. I live in Mississauga. Nobody wears, very few people wear a poppy. You people love, they come here, whatever it is, you love our way of life, you love our milk and honey. At least you could pay a couple of bucks for poppies or something like that.
On Saturday, Cherry implied immigrants can't be bothered to wear poppies for Remembrance Day. Sportsnet announced Cherry is stepping down effective immediately.
Which leads to the other controversy, which is the idea that Canada's Remembrance Day traditions have contributed to a rather frozen in time understanding of Canadian military sacrifice. The sentimentality around Canada's contribution to World War I was extended to World War II, but it often feels like Canada's Remembrance Day culture has mostly remained static since then. And as these wars become more distant, this culture of remembrance cannot help but become more and more backwards looking, more obsessed with old history, old traditions, old men, old things in general. A lot of this manifests through the Royal Canadian Legion, an organization founded after World War I that plays a prominent role in putting on Remembrance Day events across Canada. The Legion remains obsessed with a very old school aesthetic, which will be well known to anyone who's ever visited the Legion Hall. It communicates an idea that veteran culture is old people culture, with the old people who run the Legion increasingly just patriotic history fans, divorced from the concerns of the modern Canadian Armed Forces. Here is how author and veteran Robert Small described it in a 2016 editorial.
Just how open is the Legion's door to non-veterans? These military wannabes can wear the Legion uniform and occupy leadership positions right up to the highest command levels, making decisions and advising government on behalf of actual military veterans. They're also entitled to wear the Legion's own merit medals, which trusting, inexperienced members of the public often mistake for real military decorations. You do not have to serve in the military to earn them. According to the Legion, it is an uphill battle to reach out to younger generations of veterans.
And of course, Canada has lots of young veterans, men and women who served in the long Afghanistan War or other overseas deployments. But so long as Canada's dominant understanding of military service remains so bound up in nostalgia, they have far less influence over Remembrance Day culture than they probably should. Before I move on to holiday number 3, let us now just hear a word from today's video sponsor, Ground News. So, living as we do in the age of the 24/7 news cycle, it can be quite difficult to process the endless fire hose of headlines that social media is spraying at us from every angle. For this reason, I have long been a fan of news aggregator apps that help make your news consumption more efficient, so you don't have to rely on 16 different breaking news apps blowing up your phone at all hours of the day. And I gotta say, the exciting new Canadian-made news app, Ground News, is one of the best I've seen in a while. It combines many of the best aspects of some of the other news aggregator apps I've used in the past, but also adds several unique key features. The best one is this little bar they put at the bottom of major headlines to let you know if a story is playing mostly in the left-wing press or the right-wing press. So for example, you can see that this story about the Biden administration shipping vaccines overseas has gotten more coverage in liberal outlets, while this story about the state of Oklahoma suing over vaccine mandates has been more covered by the right. With Ground News's blind spot sorting feature, you can even see some of the most extreme examples of selective coverage in practice. When you're attempting to understand modern politics, it is really important to grasp the degree that people's opinions are formed by the news sources they rely on. So features like these can really help highlight some of the root causes of our polarized political climate these days, and maybe even help correct for some biases of your own. Anyway, it is a very sophisticated and very free app for serious news junkies with a ton of customizable features that I'm sure you guys will really enjoy. Just visit ground.news/JJ or click on the link in the thing below and get started today. All right, now let us talk about Canada Day. So July 1st is Canada's national holiday, the sort of all-purpose patriotic day that most countries have in some form or another. It was originally known as Dominion Day, in acknowledgement of the fact that it was the day that the modern Constitution of Canada was adopted, which established Canada as a self-governing dominion of the British Empire. And according to the city of Barkerville, British Columbia, which claims to have invented the idea of celebrating this anniversary back in 1868, the initial goal was to create a holiday akin to Independence Day in the United States. But despite Barkerville's best efforts, for a long time Dominion Day was not really much of a thing. At one time there was actually a thinking in Canada that it was un-British to celebrate a national holiday. The big change is usually said to have come on the 100th anniversary of the Canadian Constitution in 1967, which was celebrated with a huge party in Ottawa, as well as at the Montreal World's Expo, which was happening at the same time. It was a year that modeled and normalized a kind of over-the-top patriotic celebration, which has been the mainstream way to celebrate July 1st ever since. It was in the post-67 era that the idea of calling this rejuvenated holiday Canada Day became